Hello, my name is Max Cummins and I'm going to talk to you today about my role with Operation Wallacea. So Operation Wallacea are a UK-based organisation that generates its funding through paying volunteers. So volunteers that pay to visit the research sites that it runs around the world in places like Indonesia, Peru and in my case Mexico. So it uses the money generated by these students, usually several £1,000s for a couple of weeks attendance, and it pours that into conservation efforts and so on. So these students they get a fantastic experience and hands-on experience in conservation and biodiversity monitoring and environment under the supervision of scientists, and Operation Wallacea gets data out of it. So it's in stark contrast to the grant model, where a grant is provided for usually a short-term study and usually with quite a narrow focus. Operation Wallacea, this kind of self-perpetuating model of funds, where as long as it has volunteers, it will have funding for the operation. Now, really to look at that what that enables them to do is to have a much broader scope and to run for effectively indefinitely, as long as it has volunteers. So it does have some advantages over the system there. However, it does have some drawbacks, which we'll get to eventually. Now, I was at the Calakmul site in Mexico. So that is in the southern part of the Yucatan Peninsula, just touching the border with Guatemala. So it is 10.6 million hectares of continuous forest, and it is really important. So it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site of both nature and culture. So we've already discussed the culture, these ruins, Mayan ruins that are rivaled only by possibly Chichen Itza, but also nature. So it boasts 90 herpetofauna species, 50 bat species, and over 300 bird species. So it's also vital for maintaining biodiversity in the region. So you have this corridor of movement that it allows between Guatemala and more northern parts of Mexico to enable the ranging patterns of charismatic megafauna. But it's also under threat. So these charismatic megafauna species, just two of them, critically endangered. We have Baird's tapir and the jaguar. We have two species of monkey, howlers and spiders. And then some of my favourites, the strangler figs, the Ficus genus, and ocellated turkeys. So climate change is a really big threat to the region. So there's been diminishing rainfall for the last 40 years, periods of extended drought, and this has caused issues for the forest. The main water source for the forest are these aguadas, these water holes that are sustained through rainfall. When there's not enough rainfall, the aguadas run dry, and with extended droughts, many more of them are continuing to turn up dry. In some part of the park, the southern part of the core zone of the reserve, over 90% of the aguadas are coming up as dry, so it's a really big problem. Now with that comes another problem, which is human encroachment. So with this extended period of drought, many farmers are moving away from crop farming, moving towards ranching. It's better supported by the Mexican government, and unfortunately for us, it's a much greater cause of deforestation. There's also conflicts with depredation of cattle by jaguars in the area as well, which brings farmers into greater conflict, more direct conflict with the wildlife there. In fact, we have one study conducted by Leica et al. Earlier this year, and it has a direct quote from one of the farmers in the region. What is the most valuable, the life of the animal or the life of my family? And you see here just how high the stakes are for the often very poor communities in the area. So Operation Wallacea's goals in Calakmul are kind of threefold. So they run these specialist studies, of course, to raise the academic profile of the area and to keep publishing and putting out this research. So they've done two recently, both on the crocodiles in the area and on ranging and movement patterns of jaguars. Moving up from that, they look to prevent encroachment, so they communicate with local communities try and find a balance and ways to facilitate communities not clashing with the environment. In fact, they look to encourage beekeeping as a recent initiative because it's highly lucrative for the farmer, but also non-destructive to the environment. So beekeeping is something that they're really trying to encourage there. And anticipate and alleviate the effects of climate change. So this is typically done by collating all the data that they collect, all this student and volunteer-led data, looking at where the areas most badly affected are, and looking at to see whether mitigation measures are necessary to prevent population collapses. So, for instance, topping up iguanas. Now, my role in the expedition is leading the butterfly surveys. So butterflies are typically used as indicator species. They're used for indicator species for environmental change. That's what I was doing, looking at how butterfly populations interacted with human disturbance, areas of human disturbance. To that effect, I was placing traps along a transect on an increasing gradient, moving away from a disturbed area, so an area of human disturbance, so for example a road or a campsite. We were surveying these traps and checking them with students, and looking to see whether there would be a change as we moved along that gradient. But as it turns out, the research would indicate there's no significant difference in abundance and diversity in relation to distance to the road in Nymphalidae, the family of butterflies that we're looking at. But is it really that simple? So the problems with the butterfly methodology, actually there's quite a few of them. So it turns out, I was doing a bit of research into this, and beta traps aren't really a sufficient method of surveying butterfly biodiversity in an area by themselves. You need to couple that with several other methods. So for example, pollard counts and net walks as well. There's also no licenses to collect specimens, which is a real problem in an area rife with mimicry. You have the classic Batesian example of the monarch and the viceroy, both present in the region, in addition to a dozen heliconian species that all present Batesian mimicry over one species, and that species is polymorphic, so it gets really, really tricky. And butterflies, of course, aren't perfect indicator species themselves. They are predated upon by a wide variety of animals, and sometimes surveys can indicate the presence or absence of a predator more than they necessarily indicate the ecosystem doing badly or well in that area. Now that leads us to problems with Operation Wallasey's overarching business model. So they are ultimately a for-profit business, and that does lead to some conflict. Ultimately, their goals are different to than if they were a non-profit pouring all of their money back into conservation and into research. Their goals are, first and foremost, their duties are to their shareholders and to make sure that the business turns a profit. Second, to obviously produce good science and to satisfy their customers. As a result, some species are over-sampled, so charismatic megafauna are perhaps given undue representation, whereas, for example, Coleoptera wouldn't be. They don't pay the scientists running the surveys. Now, this is really, really problematic. A for-profit business not paying their staff is an issue, certainly, but especially when it comes into conflict with the quality of data they collect. Ultimately, someone that you pay several £1,000s to attend and to carry out your surveys is going to be more experienced than someone that you don't, potentially, because they can command a greater premium for their knowledge and expertise. You get what you pay for. Now, foreign scientists and students coming to work in an area, volunteer, and they take their experience and they have a great time there and they learn a lot, and then they go back to England or America or Canada, and the local community doesn't necessarily benefit. So these are some real issues that do actually occur in the area, and some of them are very difficult to fix. So how they might address those issues. So scientists pushing Operation Wallasey, publishing papers, could, for instance, look to publish their papers so that they were available in the native language of the country that they are operating under, and perhaps run lectures for local guides to make sure that the expertise is carried with them. So they could also work with local governments to provide subsidised trips to sites for groups, school students, to make sure that local communities could benefit, could gain that knowledge as well, and not have it just be out of reach for foreigners, and not for biodiversity pursuits not to be visited by the local communities, because that's a disaster. Volunteer staff, of course, pose a problem. If they paid all of them, perhaps their business model wouldn't work. They don't know their margins. It could certainly be a thing that if they covered a greater degree of their costs, they could perhaps continue to facilitate the same volunteers coming back in year out to make sure that that base of knowledge and expertise remain consistent, and thus the survey would benefit them rather than a revolving door of scientists. And finally, butterfly methodology should switch to a combination of pollard counts, netting, and bait trapping. Combination methods work best to alleviate the biases that are present within all three of those methods, and that's obviously up to date with the current scientific practice regarding butterfly surveys. That's everything. Any questions?